Hello, and welcome once again to the Sozosei Summit. I am Melissa Beck, the Executive Director of the Sozosei Foundation, and I'm so pleased to welcome you today after 2 days of incredible work together. Today, we're all here, and I know quite excited and invigorated to get underway in our design laboratory today. What is a design laboratory? Well, it's a place for sparking new ideas and innovation. It gives us the time together to practice design thinking, which is a discipline that requires us and encourages us to create new and expansive solutions to sometimes intractable problems. Today, of course, we're working together to imagine a future where mental illness is not treated as a crime. For the Sozosei Foundation, that is our North Star. Sozosei, as I hope you all know by now, means creativity in Japanese. And we're going to ask all of you to share that core value with us today in the Design Lab. Without further ado, I'm so happy to turn this meeting over to Stacy Chang, the talented Executive Director of the Design Institute for Health at the Dell Medical School at the University of Texas, Austin. Stacy and his wonderful team of colleagues will be with us today as we work together to forge the building blocks for a future to decriminalize mental illness. Stacy, over to you.
Thanks so much, Melissa. I appreciate the introduction and welcome to this day 3 of the, what we're calling the Design Thinking Laboratory. I want to reinforce a point that Melissa made just now, which is that it's going to take some creativity and hopefully interaction amongst us to really define how we move forward on the North Star that Melissa so eloquently described. Our goal today is really to utilize the perspectives and the knowledge and the inspiration we gained over the last 2 days of programming in the summit to inform what we might actually do to decriminalize mental illness. I have no doubt if we had a bottomless well of time and resources, we address every opportunity we have in front of us. But because finite resources is our actual reality, part of our goal today is to identify opportunities that promise to have the greatest effect and how we might move forward with them. So our goal really then is to think collectively about the future in a way that leads to more effective action. And we've structured the day to bring us to that outcome. So if we'll move to the next slide, what we'll do together today is really try to build a collective vision for a world where mental illness is decriminalized by eliminating the use of jails and prisons for diagnosis and treatment. We're going to work together in small groups organized around 6 alternative future scenarios. So these future scenarios are meant as provocation, and we'll describe them in a bit more detail. And then we're going to use a relatively simple virtual whiteboard to generate and critique the long-term ideas that we collectively generate. And then we're going to ask you to discuss how we can actually realize those visions by identifying what should be prioritized, what may actually stand in our way in finding that progress, and then where each of us potentially can contribute. The day is structured in a pretty obvious manner. I think one of the most important things is to set the tone for the day and what to expect. Work like this isn't necessarily easy. It actually forces us into a posture some of us may not always be familiar or comfortable with, where we're going to encourage you to think pretty expansively about what the future might hold for us. You are all experts in your field. You'll recognize the limitations that we have in our current moment. But we're going to ask you to put those aside, if only for a moment, to think about what's possible, not just what stands in our way. We're going to ask you to contribute your individual perspective and expertise, both from a lived experience point of view and a professional one as well. They are critically important in forming the way we define the future and the way we think about it. And we ask you not to be shy or to be apologetic about bringing that perspective to bear. It's really important that you bring your most creative and collaborative self. It's easy to be overwhelmed by what's possible and the challenges that we face. But taking an optimistic view of the world and seeing what we can actually build together, I think, is the posture we ask you to bring to the conversations today. And finally, challenge the assumptions and respect assumptions about what the future holds, and actually respect different points of view. We all come with different lived experience and perspective, and all of them are valid. Hopefully they combine to amplify and augment the ideas that we make today. So by way of agenda, we're going to spend just a few minutes orienting you before we get started. We want to spend the bulk of the time today actually in the group activity, generating, critiquing, and prioritizing the futures that we hope to see. But we will start with a few minutes to explain to you why design thinking as a follow-on to Melissa's introduction, and to think how to think a little bit about what we mean by futures. Then we'll spend our time in discussion. We'll break you out into breakout rooms to actually generate ideas for how we might move forward. And then we'll come back and share out some of those ideas that you think should be prioritized. We'll spend some time discussing priorities and some of the challenges that we face and the contributions that you can make. We have a few polls and discussions set up to facilitate that conversation before we reflect on the day and then close. So I'll start now with really why the Design Institute and design is being featured in this laboratory on this third day. And I'll begin with a quote, which is always a little bit useful, from Steve Jobs. You know, I think people who come to design as laypersons often think about design as a practice of aesthetics. And while the outcome of design is often something pretty to look at, hold at, or to look at or live in, it's not really just about what it looks and feels like. Design really is about how it works. And so we're going to spend quite a bit of time thinking about how we bring this reality to fruition. And it's useful to think about it in this framework. So oftentimes when you talked about innovation and what it means to bring a new future to fruition, designers will often draw this on the back of a napkin. You know, any future depends on a number of things. Obviously, the business model needs to be viable, has to be self-sustaining, it has to be funded, it has to return results that allow it to self-perpetuate. Technology is an obvious opportunity in helping address a number of the issues, but we always actually begin with people. And by people, we mean a number of different cohorts in this realm. Obviously, the people who are suffering from mental illness, but also the people who care for them. Not just the professional medical providers, but also all of the people who surround. And designing a system that actually serves all of their needs is a place we like to begin, because if you're not actually solving for those human needs, no amount of technology or business modeling will actually sustain it. And so our encouragement is, as you discuss today, the opportunities that sit in front of us, to remember that at the core of that are people and their needs. Speaking of people, you'll see the four of us from the Design Institute throughout the day. Again, my name is Stacy Chang. I'm the executive director. I'm joined by my colleagues, Lauren Gardner, who's a design researcher at the Institute, Diana Siebenaler, who helps direct partnerships and network strategy, and Adam Ziner, who's an interaction designer. You'll see us throughout the day. In design, we often talk about the domains in which we practice. The ones on the top row, product, environments, and communications, are things that I think most people are familiar with when they describe design. I think the focus of today really is to talk about the domains of design on the bottom row. We'll be talking about design of services and care models, certainly about the design of organizations and how they function, but really ultimately the design of a system. And it's a system that is indeterminate, right? No one carries ultimate authority over the system. And we have to recognize that there are a lot of interactive elements, all of which we have to, work in accord with each other and hopefully amplify each other's aims. And so keep that in mind as we go through that today. So the last slide for me here is really to express that we can all imagine a future, but in order to make it happen, we actually have to design it. And that's what the role of design holds in this effort. We can imagine a lot of different things. We also have to talk about what it is that we have to do in order to make those futures come to fruition. And so thinking about futures then is actually a pretty critically important perspective that will be necessary for the conversation we'll have today. So I'm going to hand this over to Adam Zeiner, who will give you a little bit of a primer on how to think about futures.
Awesome, thank you. So in thinking about futures, I'm thinking about the future. How do we think about what we want to collectively establish, what we want to work towards, and what we want to avoid? I'll start with this. This is the futures cone. For anyone interested in anything I talk about, feel free to reach out to me and I will talk your ear off about futures things. The futures cone is just a way to think about time expanding from the present into potential futures. We today want to think expansively. We want to move into the world of the possible, the fantastical. We want to focus on this kind of fantastical thinking, and we want to avoid thinking about things that are probable or very plausible. We want to avoid thinking about things just projecting out from where we are today. If you think about the projected future, things staying the same as they are, we might just end up in a world where we have more intuitive automated phone systems. In thinking about the future, we'll be thinking through different time horizons. We will be thinking about how change will occur over time. And we will be using this 3 horizons model that we mentioned in our primer document to situate different ideas that we talk about today. This is a framework that can be used to think about, as I mentioned, change over time, and can be used to facilitate the exploration of midterm change and long-term change. We'll use it to make sense of all of the ideas that were shared with you and all of the ideas that were discussed in the chat. Where we're going to ask you to really focus today, we really want to focus ourselves and bring our most creative selves to think about these 3rd horizon ideas, these ideas that you might call blue sky or fantastical, these longer term futures that you hope to one day inhabit. So in order to think about what we want to do, it's helpful to think about what kind of thinking we would like to avoid. It would be best, and we will ask you to avoid business as usual thinking, ideas that are currently occurring, some present day ideas. We know that there are many and myriad constraints in our present day systems that definitely need to be improved upon. But we're going to ask you today that you think beyond those present day constraints and the present day realities. We're also going to ask that, and this might be a little bit more difficult, but we're going to ask that you avoid focusing on mechanisms or ways to innovate upon the present, or ways that by innovating will get us to the futures that we would like to inhabit. We want you to avoid thinking about things that might happen a year from now or 3 years from now. Again, we really want to focus on these longer term ways of thinking, these emergent ways of thinking, things that can act as aspirational North Stars. When you think about what is this aspirational or this emerging future, some helpful criteria to think about what that might mean is think about things that are happening in the arts, or things that are happening in literature circles, or things that might be being discussed in fringe areas. Think about things that are just starting to be seeded in academic and scientific journals, or that think tanks might just start to report about. Try to avoid thinking about things that you hear about on popular broadcast channels or in the popular media, and try to avoid focusing on things that currently exist as legislation. That isn't to diminish the importance of legislation or broadcast media. It's just to really frame this as a lot of times artists or people in academia, they disrupt the status quo, and that eventually ladders up or trickles up into policy. So with that, I'll hand it over to Lauren, who will introduce today's activity.
Thanks, Adam. So now we're going to get into the doing. In a moment, we're going to send you off into separate rooms with smaller groups of folks so you all can get to know each other a bit more and work together and actually collectively build this future together. So how we're going to do that, I'm going to give you some instructions here, but don't worry, you'll have them in a document to reference in your groups. First, when you go to your rooms, select someone to represent your idea back to the plenary or the rest of the group. After the activity, which you'll have about 60 minutes for, we'll have a short break, and then we'll come back and we'll spend some time discussing what came up in your small group. So we want to make sure that someone is ready to represent your discussion. Then you'll spend some time, maybe about 10 minutes with your groups, choosing which of these 6 future scenarios to focus on. These scenarios are really prompts to help you think in a futures-oriented way. You can choose one or more than one to craft your third horizon future around. So I'll briefly describe these scenarios now, but you'll have these summaries with you in your rooms as well. The first scenario is ubiquitous and accessible data. In this future, healthcare is increasingly digital and distributed, and data is collected on all aspects of a person's health, which is shared across providers and health systems. The second scenario is low to no cost care for all. Here, the cost barriers to receiving healthcare have been dramatically reduced, and people from all different backgrounds can access the quality care they need. The third scenario is equitable distribution of wealth. In this future, significant steps have been taken to redistribute wealth and reduce the opportunity gap through education, the job market, policy, et cetera. The fourth scenario is inclusivity as the norm. Entrenched stigmas are eliminated. Here, shifts in popular culture have led to destigmatization of mental illness, and so reduced discrimination of people living with mental illness. As well, there's been an increase in prevalence of anti-racist policies and practices. Scenario 5 is a shift towards more communal housing and family structures. People are opting to live in non-traditional situations, and universal housing policies help reduce the number of folks who are unhoused in our society. And lastly, scenario 6, abundant physical infrastructure fosters social exchange. Here, funding for social institutions like libraries and parks is abundant, and the prevalence of these institutions has increased access to mental health services. So I know that was a lot that I just walked through with these 6 scenarios. You'll have more time in your small groups to really digest them and talk about which one you might want to build your future within. So after you've chosen one of these scenarios, you'll then start to generate third horizon ideas for decriminalizing mental illness in a world where your scenario or scenarios hold true. So you'll be given a link to a Jamboard, which is a virtual whiteboard. You see an image of it on the side of this slide here. There are several blue Post-its. In this step, you really want to be as generative and open to different ideas as possible, really just adding new content and ideas to those Post-its for maybe, say, 20 minutes or so. Next, you'll critique and refine your third horizon ideas. So here you'll look at what you've generated as a group and consider, for instance, these prompting questions. Does this create the future we want? And if not, what does? Maybe you'll add some more ideas to your third horizon here. Secondly, how do these different ideas interact with or influence each other? And lastly, what are the potential unintended consequences of this future? Discuss how to mitigate those and what might be done to make the outcomes more ideal. We've also given space on the whiteboard for you to move potential ideas that are first or second horizon to those horizons and to archive them that way if you want to note them as important. The last step will be prioritizing, picking one of your third horizon ideas that you see as most disruptive and most critical to decriminalizing mental illness in the future you've built. So this idea, this post-it, you'll drag a star to it like this video is showing on the slide. But this is also the idea that your speaker will represent back to the group when we all come back together. So again, you'll have these instructions when you go into your group, so you'll have some more time to digest them. You want to go to the next slide? Some tips for how to go through this exercise. First of all, this is a great time for you all to get to know each other and work together a bit. So make sure to introduce yourself whenever you first speak or to kick off your small group. Focus on the big picture. Don't get stuck in the weeds of different ideas and how they may or may not work. We really want you to think expansively here. And let go of the constraints of the present. You're really designing for a new future. So this is your chance to be big and bold and somewhat idealistic. So really go for those blue sky notions and ideas. And to be as generative and creative as possible, remember yes and. Build on each other's ideas in your brainstorm and discussion. All right. So we are going to, Diana has just dropped a link in chat. If everybody will just go click on that Google document link, that has all of the instructions, the scenarios, and links to the Jamboard, the virtual whiteboard where you will be working. I'll give everyone a moment to click on that link. We'll be then breaking you off into your rooms in a moment. Great, I see lots of people are coming to the Google document. So that will have all of the information you need. But when you get into your rooms, there will be your Zoom bar at the bottom will have a button that says ask for help. If you are lost or having any tech issues or anything at all, click that and one of the facilitators will come to your room. We'll also be circulating through the rooms in the first 10 minutes or so to make sure everyone is settled. And you'll have 60 minutes for this exercise. So we'll probably come back together. It's 11:21 now Eastern. So we'll probably come back together at 12:22 Eastern. And throughout the session, I'll be sending you time reminders, which will appear at the top of your screen. There unfortunately isn't a facilitator for each of the groups, but we'll be cycling through to make sure that you have all that you need to go through this activity. All right, I'm going to open all of our rooms now. So you should get a pop-up inviting you to join them. Go ahead and go to your breakout rooms. And if you have any issues or questions, feel free to type them in chat or speak up now. Naomi, all the breakout rooms are closing in about 20 seconds. So I can't move you back there right now. I'm sorry if you got cut short. Hey folks, I think everyone is filtering back in. Thank you so much. I'm so sorry if someone got cut off in the middle of a sentence. I know that happens. Really appreciate everyone participating in that activity. We're now going to take a 10-minute break. So feel free to turn your camera off, go get some water, whatever you need to do. We really appreciate you being here. So we will start back up at 12:35 Eastern. If you didn't get to decide, pick one or a speaker, then hopefully you remember who is in your group and you can chat them quickly in the chat function here to figure that out.
Lauren, I just had a quick question. For the individual who will be the presenter for our group, if they are not the ones who are taking the notes, is there a way to kind of get our document off our screen and send it over to that person?
Yeah, if you want to just, if you know who they are and can find them in the chat function and direct message them maybe a link to the wherever you were taking notes, that would be great.
Great, thank you.
And you won't be asked to share your screen, but good for you to have your notes in front of you. Julia, could you share your screen for us while we're on break so we can see what you've been graphically recording from the conversation so far today? And as a reminder, if you're just joining us, we're on a break. We'll come back together around 12:35 Eastern. Thanks so much, Julia. So Julia Reich from Stone Soup Creative is live graphic recording the day today. And so this is what she captured from the first half of our day, and she'll be capturing our discussion when we come back from break. So you still have about 7 more minutes if you need to take a break. All right, everyone, we are still on break, have about 6 minutes more. So enjoy some downtime. If you're just joining us, we've got 5 minutes left on a break. And what we're seeing right now is Julia Reich's graphic recording from the first half of our day today, and then we'll reconvene in now 4 minutes. Great. I hope everyone had a restful 10 minutes. We're going to get started again with discussing what we just did in our small groups.
All right, welcome back, everybody. I was fortunate enough to be in some of the group discussions, and there was a lot of energy and passion towards these ideas. So one thing we wanted to mention is Julia Reich from Stone Soup Creative. We want to make sure we capture everyone's ideas that were shared. And so we obviously will have the Jam boards that each of you were working on. And then Julia, as we get into the discussion stages, is also going to be doing graphic recording and sharing some of that. I would love to ask, and I know some groups, I think there was one group that didn't necessarily use the Jamboard. If you had another way of documenting the notes from your group, we want to make sure to connect with you. If you can email us the notes, just so that we can share that back as part of the conference recap. So each group, we'd like you to put your most disruptive idea, your group number, and your most disruptive prioritized idea into the chat. And then what we'd like to do is go through each group and have your representative in a minute or less, ideally, share what that big idea was. So, group one, do you by chance have a representative who's ready to share?
I suppose.
Thank you, Christopher.
Yes, so we decided to focus on idea 3.
Okay.
And we kind of thought the school was the place to go. If everyone had equitable access to school and it was equal across the board, that would be the hub for our future community. We thought about how the community or that school should represent the people in the community. So when students are going to this school, they're seeing people who are actually a part of their community look like them. That there's equal access to health and other support services available within that school, and not just for the student, but for the full family, really making sure that we're holistic. It's not just the student, it's the entire family system. Looking at restructuring the curriculum, really moving away from standardized tests and moving towards hope and purpose, focus more on the strengths or the unmet needs of the individuals. And focusing, especially, thinking about when a youth makes a mistake, that they are connected to a community healer, where that community healer has a conversation with them so that they can better understand the supports and how we can better really bring that person back into the fold of the community and really support them forward. And school as a social empowerment hub is kind of the overall kind of idea that we kind of ended on. So those are kind of very brief pieces that we touched on.
Wonderful. Christopher, that's such a beautiful idea. The school as a social empowerment hub. I love that. Group number 2, do you have a representative who would like to share?
And this is Adam. I was sitting in on group 2, so I'm happy to share really quickly. And then if Leslie or Sonia wanted to fill in anything that I missed, if you're comfortable doing so, that would be awesome. My understanding of what group 2 was most excited about was more so an approach to care, a more holistic, whole person approach across the continuum of care, not solely focused on the point of care, but something that extended into schools, that extended to supporting people find jobs. My understanding was very much the approach to care that was most exciting for group 2.
Okay. Group 2, anything you want to add to Adam's summary? Okay. If you have other thoughts you want to add, please feel free to put them in the chat. Group 3. Do we have a representative?
This is Nancy. I'm the designated representative. I guess I'd say, before focusing on the prioritized idea, that we ended up having, I would say, sort of 4 categories of ideas we had focused on among the sort of scenarios 2, 3, and 6. And so our, oh shoot, there it is. Our jam board was ended up being, we had a bunch of things that were about budget and access to care and equal distribution of care, and then others that focus specifically on how the justice system itself interacts with people with mental illness, and some that were about sort of more stigma and commitment and sort of general culture change around attitudes and attitudes and views of people with mental illness and the connection between mental health and physical well-being. But we did focus a lot on just like at getting people what was needed in order to thrive. And so we decided to go big. And so our big idea was that there is a cure for serious mental illness that is permanent and easily accessible to all. And that's both about accessibility of healthcare, but also that the research and development is done and has been supported and continues, and that cure, the ability to sort of help people not be in, help people to thrive, really, to not be in pain, to thrive, and was sort of most compelling to all of us.
That's very cool. You guys really jumped into the third horizon with thinking about a cure. That's wonderful. That's wonderful. And as we'll talk about kind of in the rest of our time together, you know, the reason behind thinking around Horizon 3 is to think about the big, hairy, audacious, the really aspirational view. Because sometimes when we get stuck in the day-to-day, it leads to incremental improvement, which is still really important. But the way to get to that transformational improvement is to sometimes have that aspirational vision as a guide and then work backwards. Group number 4. Is there someone who would like to share?
Hey, I'm Hallie, and I'm reporting in for Group 4. And it's nice to see so many familiar faces and also meet some new people. So Group 4, we picked scenario 6 to start with, which was really around infrastructure. And infrastructure became a jumping off point as we reflected that better infrastructure would be nice, but it wasn't what we felt was critical. Like we moved towards thinking about the people as the main thing that we thought was important for decriminalizing mental illness, that we wanted to reduce stigma around behavioral health needs. We wanted citizens to have a better sense of how to access behavioral health care. We wanted citizens to have alternatives to law enforcement, to call in crisis. We wanted citizens to have trust in the behavioral health system. So the idea we centered on was people helping people, which is not infrastructure, but that was what we felt was important.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing, Haley. Group 5.
Hi, it's Steve Leifman. Good to
Hi,
see
Steve.
Hallie and Chris. Thank you all. We had a very robust conversation, and we had a bunch of really great big thinkers. And so it was hard to come up with one, but what we came up with was first trying to figure out how to identify what those essential elements a community needs to have a system of recovery. And then to develop a system because each community is going to be different. And the whole idea was to apply some type of population health model as opposed to a criminal justice model to the problem. And so the community would then meet, they would figure out where the gaps are in their system, and then they could apply for the resources through some governmental entity to then build the capacity in the community. And we came up with basically 10 essential elements that we saw are necessary to develop that kind of recovery. And that would include, you know, starting early, moving upstream where there'd be assessment tools to identify trauma, you know, to, you know, an ideal crisis care system, to post-arrest system, and to use technology to do a better job to both bring care to rural communities, you know, and you know, we even talked about, you know, a lot of rural communities don't even have hospitals anymore to take someone. So, why not use a church or a community facility where someone could be brought and there could be telehealth there? And, how do we do mobile medical treatment? Because we also looked at the comorbidity of primary and psychiatric care. Why aren't we bringing mobile units to rural communities to provide care, both psychiatric and primary? So we thought big, and we have a huge chart we'll be happy to share with you, but it was very exciting and we appreciated the opportunity. And if anybody else from group 5 wants to jump in, please do.
Wonderful. Okay, group 6.
Hi there, from group 6, and we had a really great conversation. We were focused on low to no cost care for all and abundant physical infrastructure. And in terms of our sort of big disruptive idea, we settled after describing sort of many on the ground components, including quality access to care at sort of every venue available to everybody, regardless of status, the end of homelessness, access to everything that gives people joy, music and art for everybody. We settled on this notion of our policy making and our legislation should be proactive and not reactive, and should consistently be transformative to promote the whole health of the person. So we integrated mental health into the person as just another aspect of the person, as well as the whole community health and care for the community. Thanks, and we had a great group. So thanks to Carla, Aurora, Kadia, Debbie, Tapia, and Christina.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you, Anne-Marie, for sharing. Group 7.
All right, so for group 7, we chose the equitable distribution of wealth. And what we chose on this idea is guaranteed family support. So this would include basic needs, not so much the wants of the world, but the basic needs. So the idea of wealth as both educational opportunities and community health. So for families, it would be a combination of career pathways and healthcare with wraparound services from early childhood education to college, leading to career paths and work opportunities. In healthcare, it would be all access, warm handoffs, the right service at the right time. And what I would say was our most disruptive idea was to realign wages based off of societal need. So teachers and providers being paid what their worth is.
Ooh, love that. As a daughter of 2 teachers, I get that. That's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing, Nina. Group 8. And we have 14 groups, which is, I would love to discuss each of these more, but I want to make sure we can get through all.
So hi, everyone. My name is Erica Brittle, and I'm a part of group 8. So we actually had a interesting conversation, but we were able to sort of conclude that there is a need for a national system of care for treating neuropsychiatric illnesses. We had a conversation surrounding moving away from the term mental illness to neuropsychiatric illnesses. And so coming up with a national system to kind of address it, something similar to what the Trevor Project was working on. And we also felt as though there must be accountability and compliance with the neuropsychiatric illnesses party. There must be early evidence-based treatment for children and teens with trauma, require all insurances to offer standard set of required coverages, must cover evidence-based treatment for trauma experienced by children in trauma.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing, Erica.
Of course.
National system.
Yes.
And as was talked about, I think on day 1, language around how we describe this is so critical and so important in destigmatization. Group 9. Do you have a representative who would like to share?
Yes, hi, it's Alpha Stewart. I'm standing in
Hi.
for our designated reporter who had to step away.
Okay.
We selected scenario 2, low,
Okay.
no cost healthcare as the norm. And our big disruptive position is that there is no health without mental health. And so in order to do that, we have to build a system for quality with collaborative focus on continuous improvement at reasonable cost. And we had several different buckets that we explored in our, what sounds like every other group, a robust discussion of this. And it included things like access to transportation, decentralizing where services are located, so that the people most in need and currently unable to access will at least be able to access, that we create a system that has people in the system receiving those services able to access and control and participate using their own data in their treatment. Creating a more robust, diverse, and extraordinary mental health workforce, and particularly for the population of individuals who are mentally ill and incarcerated or likely to be incarcerated, and including all of the natural community supports that we now acknowledge are important, but that we have to build into the system to assure that they are available. Certainly the destigmatization and work against the discrimination of people with mental illness, calling on that vibrant discussion yesterday in the chat around stigma being a euphemism for discrimination, and we need to really start calling that out. Addressing people's whole needs, that these are not just illnesses, that these are people who are experiencing, and I like the term just used, neuropsychiatric disorders, to elevate it to the level of a medical problem and take it out of the arena of something where you can criminalize a healthcare issue. And then finally, just a general understanding that without improved funding, we won't get to these systems. And so, like another group has already said, being very proactive and adamant in our advocacy for improving funding, access, location, the fact that some communities rely on these systems for their economic success, that we've got to create different structures to normalize this for individuals who are mentally ill.
Thank you, Dr. Stewart. Group number 10, do you have a representative?
Yes, I'm representing Group 10. And after batting around a number of the topics, we settled on housing, which was number 5. And we said there will be a complete continuum of care, including housing, available based on the specific needs of individuals with a serious mental illness. Some of the care and housing will be transitional, and others may be permanent. And it will be based on patients' needs, not money, and it would be embedded and integrated and distributed across communities. And to take your point, Diana, at the end, we're like, that doesn't seem like a big, hairy, audacious, disruptive idea. But then we had to check our own preconceived conceptions at the door, and we were like, talked about all the NIMBYism and the resistance to initiatives like this that exist in communities. So.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing, Betsy. Group 11.
This is Pat Victorson, and I'm representing our great group. We initially discussed 2, 3, and 5, but we decided to prioritize scenario 2. And we came up, as I think some people have indicated, but we're calling this high quality, universal, national healthcare with mental health parity. So, this is, we had a lot of discussions around this, some of which have been discussed with the previous groups. We also thought about, we love the idea of the moonshot for the brain. We really need to invest in research when it comes to mental health, but we feel that high quality care for everyone is an absolute necessity. And again, we did discuss a lot of some of the weeds there. We liked the idea too about realigning our wages based on societal needs. Finland might be an idea. We were drawing on a lot of international ideas. I think we really need to look at what's happening in other countries and pick their brains. We're not the only ones in the United States that can come up with good ideas. But anyway, we're focusing on really getting to universal health care that includes mental health.
Wonderful. Thank you, Pat, for sharing. Group number 12. And also group 13, if you can put your prioritized idea in chat, that would be very helpful for our next activity. Group 12, is there a representative? Oh,
yes.
Sorry.
Can you see me?
Yes, thank you. Hi, Evelyn.
Yeah, this is Eve Stratton. I'm a retired justice from the Ohio Supreme Court, been working in this field for 40 some years. I'm going to be a bit of a disruptor myself and say that we were a little disappointed in the 6 choices. We felt it was an agenda for social change that really didn't allow us to look at what we have built. And I would have liked to have seen our groups talk about what's worked and what we can take to scale. So we were all family members who have dealt with serious issues. And so we just felt like that was such a broad agenda with so much lofty ideas and no practical things coming out of it. So we hope this can translate into a practical agenda, because great conferences don't do any good until they have practical agendas. And I've been to many of them. So that said, with my little disruptor, and everyone in our group unfortunately felt the same way, we focused on a combination of 1 and 2. And that is one of the biggest barriers that anyone who's had a family member has faced, is the inability to help them because of all the civil rights laws and all the privacy protections and the HIPAA, both in the state and the federal. And so you become unable to help a child who clearly, or a family member or someone who clearly has no insight, has no ability to make rational decisions, yet the law gives them that protection. And therefore you end up having to find out that they have to actually commit a crime or harm somebody or get into the criminal justice system to get help. And so it's a very delicate balance, because there's a lot of people out there wanting to protect civil rights, but everybody who's dealt with somebody, with all the resources I had and all the work I've done state and nationally, I've had 2 people I was totally unable to help because they were not a danger to others and not harming others, and yet they both ended up dying. And so that's the system. We have to find a better balance so that we have the ability to get information, to give information, to share information, to help people before they end up in the criminal justice system. So that was our big disruptor idea.
Thank you so much for sharing, Eve, and thank you for sharing that feedback around the prompt. We know it's a big challenge, and in the limited time we have, in the continuing discussion, we're going to kind of talk about some of those bridging ideas and how do we get to the big aspirational future. Group number 13.
Yeah, this is Ron Bruno, and we chose for our future scenarios the low to no cost care for all and inclusion as the norm. And we really went out there on our future vision. It's behavioral health as a healthcare system responsibility. And we want to look at it first off by recognizing that everybody that's involved recognizes that the brain is part of the body. So it needs to be handled in the healthcare system completely. We also came up with a few statements to back that up, such as all communities have easy access to mental health care and integrated health care. If you look how people can basically go to almost anywhere to a clinic to get some assistance with physical health, we need to also have that available for the mental health care. We also say that behavioral health care is sufficiently funded at all levels, from early detection, first episodes or onset, outpatient care, and also in inpatient care. so that way we are looking at how we're going to fund this in every single area. And by the time we get into the future, for persons having any type of mental health care issue, they have easy access, either through telephone, through their medical doctor, through a clinic. And if crisis is to be handled, it's handled completely by the behavioral health care system.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing, Ron. And group 13. Group 14. Do you have a representative who would like to share?
Hi, Diana. This is Tina Erskine.
Hi, Tina.
Hi. So we looked at 1, 4, and 5, and we settled on mandated purity for all illnesses, which we were able to wrap a lot of our spoken to ideas into. If we have at a, and I love somebody said national level, we were using federal, but at a national level, if you have a mandate for each state to meet certain guidelines and to implement certain programs, then we thought that would be very helpful. So starting at that national level, creating that, which can be difficult in itself, and looking at brain wellness centers, and I like the term somebody used on neuropsychiatric illnesses. We need wellness centers. We have kidney dialysis centers. We have, cancer centers. We have specialty places. Sure, we have mental hospitals, which have been closed for the most part, or such as in the state of Texas, you can only be sent there for a period of 45 days and extended one time. Then what do you do with the person if you haven't reached them? So we need a compassionate place for care for anybody with mental illness. Then we looked at, and I'm very passionate about, a personalized, centralized, coordinated case management. We spend so much money at the level of every single medical clinic and level. My son through 4 months has been through 4 different hospitals and respite centers and now an acute long-term rehab center. Every single one of those I've had to adjust and get to know different case managers. If over the past 5 years of being treated at the county level, he had one case manager who understood every medication, how it impacted him, and everything, and worked with him all the way through the system, he wouldn't have ended up 2 years homeless on the streets. And then lastly, for not just the person, but the families as well, from that initial diagnosis of mental illness, we need training. I've had to find my own places, organizations, and literature to read to even understand what was happening. I didn't know anything about mental illness. So fortunately, I'm the kind of person that can jump in, but there are so many families who are not initiators and are not tenacious, and they have no idea where to go. So we feel like a training process needs to be part of this, something like Grace Alliance has in bringing it in. So that's our 2 cents worth.
I would say it's a lot more than 2 cents in a very positive way. Thank you so much, Tina and Group 14, for sharing. Thank you all for sharing these incredible ideas. So the next step we would like to go into, and Lauren has been so kind as to, she has been documenting these top ideas as you guys have been sharing them. And we have created a poll. And so what we'd like to understand from all of the 14 ideas that were shared today, what would be the top 3 that you would select that we really need to prioritize moving forward? And so with that, Lauren, I don't know if we're ready to launch the poll.
Yes, I was just making sure I had captured everyone's ideas, and I apologize to any groups if I didn't capture very well.
So while Lauren is getting that ready, I'll just add a few things here, which is part of the goal of this poll is not to definitively identify the ones that we're going to work on, but just to see where the center of gravity and interest is. We've had some really interesting shares coming out of these 14 groups, and we know there's a lot of richness. I had a chance to visit most of the groups in discussion, and there's a lot of richness in there, which we will not lose because we've captured all of the notes from those Jamboards. But what we want to do is get a sense from you all for where you think some of the most important gravity is. So what you see on screen now is a poll that captured a summation of the 14 different ideas that came out of each group. Take a few minutes and capture and vote for at least one, but you can vote for more of the ideas that you think matters most.
You'll have to select at least one option in each of the 2 questions to be able to submit your answers. But we want to gather the top 3.
And if you scroll down, that's where, so because there are 14 groups, we had to create 2 separate polls, which is why you'll see the 2 questions. And then while we're doing that, Julia is actually sharing some of the notes that she captured as our graphic recorder and illustrator during those discussions. So if it helps to provide more context around some of those ideas. All right, I'm seeing, this is so cool to see in real time.
Yeah, votes are coming in. Thank you, Sonia. For group 2, continuum of needed housing options is also part of that idea. Apologies for not capturing that.
Let's see.
Have about 20% and climbing. 25% of people have voted.
It keeps changing so rapidly. Otherwise, I would give a play-by-play.
Peggy, your submit button might not work if you didn't select one of the choices under each of the 2 questions. So you'll have to scroll down, and there's an option that says none of these options. If, for instance, all the ones you wanted to select were in question 1, just because Zoom only allows 10 options and we have more ideas than that. So we had to break it up as such.
I see a lot of traction around group number 8, so a national system of care. And I see a lot of traction around group number 6, policymaking and legislation being proactive, which makes sense because those 2 things would likely go hand in hand. Removing barriers to care and treatment, group 12 also seems to be getting a lot of traction. And then group number 5, basically the assessment of each local community, and then a matchmaking program to either build capacity or align them with existing resources. Let's see, we're at 64% of people have voted. We'll give this another couple of minutes.
Yeah, and if folks aren't seeing the poll, it pops up as a separate window, so it won't be you won't see it on the screen where you see Diana's face or my face or Julia's drawing. So you may need to take your Zoom off full screen to find it if you don't see it right away.
Great advice, Lauren.
70% of folks voting. Let's give another 30 seconds. And if for some reason you can't access the poll, then please drop your votes in chat and we will be sure to take note of them.
And we're pausing for silence intentionally based on the comment in the chat.
Just a couple more seconds, and then we're going to end the poll.
Okay, thank you guys so much for sharing your feedback. It looks like Aurora, great question. We will work with Sozosei to get potential recordings to you, and then also we can share kind of the collective Jamboards and notes. Okay, we have a couple other questions in the chat that I just want to elevate. Did anyone specifically discuss civil commitment laws? Sonia is interested in that. And then also Tina saying the problem with expectations at a national level is getting it done. Our policymakers leave much to be desired. It will take a huge amount of advocacy to get it done. So does anyone want to share?
Diana, let's kind of share what the results are. Everybody should be seeing it, but in case you aren't, some of the top votes came to Group 8, a national system of care with a standard for treating neuropsychiatric illnesses. It got 37 votes, which was the highest. After that, we have the Group 12, remove barriers to care and treatment, and getting people help before it's too late, got 28 votes. And Group 11, high quality universal national healthcare with mental health parity, got 26 votes. So those are the top 3 ideas that I'm seeing. Diana, if you want to lead us in a discussion.
So, so it seems like, especially for IDEA and Group 8 and Group 12 and 11, there seems like there could be some overlap potentially between those ideas. I would love to hear from someone who prioritized those, if you want to share a little bit about why those things feel like the most important to you. Adam, 8, 12, 11, 10, 13 plus 5, and 7. Thank you for summarizing where the priorities were. Does anyone want to share why they picked the ideas that they did, and what felt the most compelling?
I'll jump in. The national system of care is very compelling in that we have people all across the country doing a lot of the very same work in each and every state, in each and every county. And the idea of being able to collaboratively work on something from a national point of view and have it be standardized so that the level of care that you get doesn't depend upon your zip code would be hugely helpful. It would also help to simplify the legal aspects of things as well, because when we're, even as a family member in a state who's public, if you get contacted by somebody from some other county or some other state, it's very difficult to give answers to them because you have to look into the law to be able to provide that. So national is very exciting. We could probably, I believe we could accomplish that if we tried.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing, Leslie. Go ahead, Stacey.
Jim Bloss raised his hand. Jim, can we hear from you?
Yes, thanks. I was in Group 8. I think the thought is on the national system of care, yeah, actually, with the emphasis on system. I mean, if you, it would be nice to think that somewhere along the line that somebody had considered an actual system. You can't have all the other pieces of it without an actual focused, designed system that everybody understands the way it should work, and what have you. You're not going to get parity. You're not going to get all of the things that you're looking for if you don't have something you can bump against. A continuum of care would be impossible. How can you have a continuum of care if you don't have the basic outline and performance standards, which would be part of such a system, and accountability. But you can't have any of that without a system that is designed that everybody could see, a visual, and understand, particularly if something goes wrong, in a crisis situation. Well, hey, what does our system look like? What needs to be fixed? But you got to have that system. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. I think that's really great. It'd be nice to elevate, because there's a little bit of overlap in some of the other ideas as well, especially in Group 11, which talked about a national healthcare system. But I think there was a particular focus in Group 11 on this notion of mental health in parity with other physical health and illnesses. I'd love to know, if someone voted for that and feels particularly passionate about it, why you think mental health parity in particular is such a critical aspect of this effort.
My name's Kathy Bullock, and I will speak. I believe mental health parity is critical because it eliminates all of the discrimination that systemically occurs around having a severe mental illness. It also addresses the racial discrimination. I believe that also particularly occurs if you have a severe mental illness. And it ensures that neuropsychiatric health or behavioral health, both terms are really the same. I like the term neuropsychiatric. It ensures that it's treated holistically with what is now separated as physical health. So that, for me, is why mental health parity is so important.
Thanks so much, Kathy. Evelyn, you raised your hand for a second. I'm going to come to you in a second, but I want to follow up on this this idea that Kathy's been commenting on. If we recognize that mental health parity is so important, let me ask this question: how do you think we should go about doing that? And not just for you, Kathy, for anybody else as well, but feel free to lean in.
Yeah, I don't mean to lean in too much to my computer. The reason I think mental health parity is so important is because a lot of people still don't view mental illness as a physical illness. If we had parity, then I think that would go a long way with educating the public as a whole that yes, guess what? Mental illness is a neuropsychiatric illness. It is a physical illness. The brain is an organ of the body. And yes, severe trauma can change the way your brain works. And I just think a lot of people don't understand that, but particularly for those of us with loved ones who have either bipolar or schizophrenia or unipolar depression, et cetera, substance use disorders. That just goes a long way to, I know the term destigmatizing is used, or stigma. I think it's also discrimination. It goes back to, it eliminates discrimination because it educates people that mental illness is a physical illness. And I'll be quiet and let somebody else talk.
Yeah, I think, Kathy, in there, in trying to answer the question how, one of the things you were talking about is messaging and the need for communication to actually rethink the way we think about disease. I'm going to open this question to others as well before we go to Evelyn. Is recognizing how important mental health parity, mental illness parity is for mental illness. Can you guys suggest some ideas for how we make that happen? Not just why it's important, but actually how we do it.
Yeah, this is Keith from Kentucky.
Yeah,
I think how is that when there's parity. And I think that the reimbursement rate should be reflective in there. as well. So you said it's not to talk about how to get it done, but I think that's what I'm hearing you say. But I think one of the ways how you get there is that we provide reimbursement rates that give hospitals, groups, organization an opportunity to be hopeful for the future. If these managed care companies, state managed entities, get to a point where they just cut to bare minimum, and then these groups and these entities just barely exist.
Your recording has reached the maximum length. To replay,
move on to the next. There we go. Evelyn, if you might want to unmute before you speak.
Okay, so our group agreed with all the things that have been said. It's parity is actually already the law. We've had lawsuits and cases on it when I was a judge. The problem is it's not been enforced, and there's going to be a real need in the changing of attitudes towards mental health being a issue that is exactly like any other physical disease, like a heart attack or stroke, before we really see parity accepted as a reality. We can put laws on the books, but when the society doesn't still view it as the same as a physical illness, then we aren't going to really get to parity. But we need to really put pressure on our legislators, our insurance regulators, particularly, to enforce the laws that are on the books, which are not being enforced now. There's a lot of discrimination. But the reason we went to ours in 12 is you can have all the parity, you can have all the laws, you can have all the treatment, but if you can't access it because your child or loved one doesn't think they're sick, refuses to get help, but it clearly is in a crisis and is going to end up either suicidal or in prison if you don't help them, you still have to remove those barriers that we have now that every single parent I've ever talked to, including Pete early on down, has experienced in trying to get someone access to care. So we have to do something about removing that barrier, even if we were to achieve parity.
Evelyn, thank you for that perspective. That's really helpful. Jim, I'll call on you before we move on to the next poll. Jim?
Right. Yeah. I'm glad the judge brought that up. Just a reminder that mental health parity was written into law at the national level. Jeepers, I think it was about a decade ago, even that long. But with many of the states putting that requirement into place in their states, I'm from Washington, and we put it in actually before the national, I think 2008. There's even a national group of folks, I can't remember who is the center of that gets together to talk about which states have had to go to lawsuits to get their states to comply. That's what some of the states are doing. So Judge Stratton is correct that the law is there, but the compliance is weak. Thank you.
Thanks again, Jim. I want to visit just one last topic here before we launch to the next poll, which is the third group idea that actually got the most votes was around removal of barriers in care to treatment. And I know in particular that group was talking about removing some of the restrictions like HIPAA that allow parents to access the information and to actually care for their loved ones and their kids. And so there's this notion of informal caregivers as well. I'm curious, for anyone who voted on group 12, do you have a particular thought on the role of informal caregivers and how that needs to play out in the very near future? Yep, Jim, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was actually trying to take my hand down, but it was already down. Sorry.
Okay, good. Well, we're seeing a lot of messages show up in chat, and because we'd love to hear from everyone, but don't have the time to do it, please do capture any notions that you have in the chat, and we will ensure that they're captured as part of the output and input into the summit and as part of the output from the learnings. So we're going to launch a second poll, and again, it's a little bit artificial in the sense that we're going to take the three ideas that were voted most highly in this poll and ask you about barriers. And we're not necessarily trying to solve for just these three issues, but you'll see in the poll what we're trying to get at. So go ahead and launch this poll. Yeah, thanks, Lauren. So what we're asking here is, you know, there are a lot of barriers to change. You all discussed them in the groups that you were in. We're hearing some of them raised here. We're seeing them in the chat. And as you think about the ideas that you're most passionate about, maybe the top three ideas that we talked about, national standards and parity and the idea of opening up information flows, but maybe even the things that you cared about most, what do you think are the biggest barriers? What stands in the way of realization of these futures that we've all described? So take a few minutes, read through those, and make a vote. You can pick as many as you wish, and then I'll be quiet for a few minutes to allow you to. In case you can't see the question, it's in chat as well. And if there are some responses that you would like to provide but are not provided as options, feel free to put them in chat. Good. We'll give people a few more minutes to complete this poll, but since we can see the results live, I'm gonna name a couple of these that are interesting, and I'm gonna ask you first to sort of note some any of your thoughts in chat, and then we'll use that to foster a bit of a conversation around this poll in particular. So I think it's unsurprising that we would see political will and stigma and discrimination rise to the top. It's a topic of conversation that's been present in all 3 days of this summit, and I think it's well understood. I think Jim put it nicely: money, power, and politics, the big three in practically any national level decision making. And so politics, and then I think, as Monica said, the use of politics and power is to get the money. So those three are in cahoots with each other for sure. I'm actually kind of interested in two responses in particular: investment and siloed bureaucracies. So when we said investment, that's a pretty broad term. I'm curious, and please put this in chat, what you think needs to be invested in order to make these changes happen. And then for siloed bureaucracies, what are the silos? What's being kept from each other, and where do those bridges need to be built? Yep, financial investment. Yeah, so investment in actually paying the practitioners themselves, investment in stigma reduction, that's great.
Also comments about the genetic validation, it sounds like, or the science validation behind it.
Mm-hmm. So Linda Spielman, maybe can I invite you to ask you to comment on the IMD exclusion, because that's shown up a couple times here.
Hi, yeah, I'm not sure I can explain the whole history, but basically what it does is it limits the ability of there to be psychiatric hospital beds available for people who need to get care. So one of the problems with criminalization is when you bring people to the hospital, they don't have beds to treat them. That's a huge thing. And this is something that's embedded in the Medicare, the Medicaid laws that would need to be changed in order to lift that and fund more psychiatric beds across the country in each state.
Mhm.
I hope I said that right, but others can.
That's great. Someone else had in the chat, scrolling quickly, Kathy Anna, you had mentioned IMD as well as HIPAA. I'm going to invite you to share some thoughts on that. Kathy, you may be on mute.
Yeah. Okay. I'm Kathy Bullock, actually, and it's my middle name. But
Oh, okay.
yes, the IMD exclusion, if money's not available, because a person has a quote unquote mental illness, which is actually, as we all know, a biological illness, then what can hospitals really do? That doesn't incentivize the creation of beds. And then HIPAA treats mental illness differently than physical illness, when we know mental illness is a physical illness. When my father had a heart attack, that information was shared with me by a hospital. When my loved one had a psychotic episode, I couldn't get any information. So this all goes back to me to having that national neuropsychiatric, I forget the wording that was used, but to having a national system in place. And the ways to do it would be specifically to address HIPAA. And I think the HIPAA law is hopefully about to be changed a little bit to help, but also that IMD exclusion. I mean, those are very pragmatic things that can be addressed.
Yeah, thank you very much. I want to call on Nadia. I think you raised the role of racism, which is maybe one of the biggest silos, if you think of it that way. Could you share some thoughts on what the comment you posted in chat?
Sure. So, I mean, I think especially in the context of the criminalization of folks with mental illness and substance use disorders, it's clear that that does not bear equally across communities. Black and brown individuals are criminalized at far higher rates. They see much more violent responses from our system. They're more likely to be killed by the police in a time of crisis. And so I think, it's just critical to consider the role that racism has played in our systems, and who we consider to kind of, quote unquote, deserve compassionate care, and who we consider to be a problem and someone that we can just lock away.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thanks for reinforcing that in particular. Karina, and apologies, I'm not sure if I got your last name right. Yeah, you raised a topic around epidemiology. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that if you're willing to share.
Yeah, as far as I know, there's no epidemiology for serious mental illness going on a national level, let alone a state and community level. And if people could be, diagnosed, or that could go into an actual epidemiology. And then on the community level, it would help with that needs assessment. And then there would also be a national standard of care. And then they would know where to send resources based on epidemiology.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that. I see a lot of commentary on investment in changing the dialogue and stigma, and that definitely does require an investment. I also see a few notes here about education, and education is a fairly broad topic. And if we're talking about investment in education in particular, I'm kind of curious what people mean by that, or what they. So I think there's one person here in particular, Leslie Carpenter. You talked about educating early. Can you tell me a little bit about what your thoughts were there?
Sure, absolutely. What I mean is educating at the time of the first psychotic episode, right? First episode psychosis programs that are available in some places. Here in Iowa, we only have one of those programs. And when our son had his first episode, we were not even made aware of this being a possibility. And ever so sadly, mostly people are discharged before they're actually stabilized to the point where they can become aware of their own illness, and for the family to even become aware of their own illness. So educating the families and the patients right from the get-go would be key. keeping them in the hospital long enough until they're able to be stabilized, and not institutionalizing them in the hospital, but having it actually be a quality, kind, compassionate setting. Secondly, education expands beyond that. It's also educating everybody in our country, especially the lawmakers, to help understand that this is a neurobiological problem. These are things that we should be treating, and educating them also from the aspect of where we're spending now isn't working. So we need to stop that. We need to actually spend our money on the front end, not the back end.
Yeah, I
So,
appreciate that. I'm
global.
curious, any other thoughts on where we might be educating?
Yeah, let me chime in here. I think the complexity of the educating the community and the family and loved ones. And what comes to mind is Mothers Against Drunk Drivers. And then, so the Mothers Against Drunk Drivers says, if you drink and drive, this happens. So over time, they was able to move the needle in a short period of time and gain so much. So then when we come to the table and educate, we have so much to educate people about.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I really appreciate that. Well, good. This is a really rich conversation. I appreciate all that's going on in chat. And if we had hours more, we would do it all of it justice. But we're going to move on to a final poll here before we head towards some reflections and discussion. The third poll here is not one we're going to spend a lot of time discussing, but one of the things that you all represent is not only just expertise and perspective, but also resources. And I don't just mean dollars, right? I mean a long-term knowledge, experience, overcoming barriers, experience as caregivers. And so this question is a little bit more of a personal one for you, or you can think of it as for your organization, is if we were to ask you to contribute to this broad effort, where do you think you could best contribute? And you feel free to choose more than one response.
What do you mean by communication channels?
You have networks that you can disseminate messaging through, that you can share knowledge.
Okay, thank you.
And what do you mean by resources?
That's a little bit up for resources. Could be know-how, but it could be, I have technology or other abilities that could be utilized in the effort. Thank you, Monica. Passion is no small thing in this field. Thanks for sharing that. Great. We'll give you another 30 seconds or so to finish off this poll. We really appreciate the engagement, and there's no lack of passion in this group. That is for certain. It looks like the last few votes are rolling in, and we'll leave the poll open for a few more minutes. But while we're doing that, Lauren, if we can move to the last slide, or the next slide rather. You all have contributed to a lot of conversation. You've heard a lot in the first 2 days. Hopefully this third day gave you an opportunity to voice some of your own perspective as well, in the small groups, in the polls more officially, in chat as well, but also in this large group. And you don't go through 3 days of content like this without spending some time and reflecting on what it is that you thought you heard, or what made you think differently, or where you think the big efforts or challenges are. So these questions on screen right now are really just prompts, and I encourage you to respond in the chat, and then we'll elevate some of these. But as you think back to the first 2 days of presentations, and then today, which was meant to be much more interactive, are there ideas or conversations that have been really thought-provoking, that made you think differently than you did when you entered? Are there big efforts that you think that matter, but will be the most challenging to pursue? What do you think we need to do to move this conversation forward? And then where is the area that you think you have leverage to affect you personally, and on what time frame do you think that should happen? So take a minute or two, think about some of these questions, respond to the ones that compel you, and put your answer in chat. For Dewey, and for those of you who are asking about recordings, we will share out via channels about the output from this summit later. And so you'll see some communications about that. So I'm going to dig into some of the things that are showing up here. We're hearing a lot of passion around a national approach, national standards, a national system. That siloing between states is creating a lot of duplicative effort rather. So let's see, experience in writing legislation and analyzing public policy. Hey, Linda, maybe I could get you to talk about that some. You know, policy obviously showed up as a huge issue, political will as well. Do you think there's a gap in our ability to actually write effective policy? And Linda, if you're responding, you may need to come off mute.
Sorry about that. Yes, there is often a huge gap between what policymakers put down on paper and pass as legislation and how that legislation is then implemented on the ground. And we see that a lot here in California with our Lanterman-Petrus Short Act that was enacted over 50 years ago. The intentions of the legislators who put that together were to help people get treatment within the community. But the effect it has had basically is to keep people from being able to get treatment due to the strict civil rights they built into it, which allows a person to go around with untreated psychosis, disintegrating basically, and ending up in jails, the streets, and morgues, and getting the care they need for the really very small and comparative period where they need to get stabilized and come back to have their decision-making capacity then restored. So yes, there's a huge gap, and that's something that really needs to be examined closely with people that are putting together. These policymakers do not understand these diseases very well, or the systems that execute the care.
Thank you for that, Linda. I think I see a lot of nodding heads, so you have some folks in agreement with you on that front. I will call out for the Sozosei Foundation that there are more than a couple comments asking for more conversation, more summits and panel discussions. I think what this 3-hour session demonstrated is that 3 hours is not nearly enough time to contain all of the knowledge that people bring and expertise in the conversation that needs to be had. And I think some of that represents the complexity of the problem. Someone in here had written around complexity, Monica Luke. And I think one of the challenges is that this is not a simple problem. Obviously, if it were a single factorial issue, we would have solved it by now, but it's multifactorial. It's indeterminate in some way. It's very much a system issue. I'm kind of curious, Monica, if you had something else to add to the notion of the complexity of the issue.
Sure. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. Yeah, so one of the things that the last 3 days has shown is how you can't just push on one part of the system. And I think, that's part of why the document that Andy Keller shared has, like 8 prongs, I think, to it. But there's also sort of this trying to squeeze into the middle. So, when you think about the third horizon, I wish instead of having those prompts, we would have talked, if we could blow up the whole system, how would we build a new one? Because I think the system is so fragmented and so busted and so complex that we're going to continue to play whack-a-mole. You push on one thing and it pops up in another place. So a couple of people have mentioned the lack of the peer voice here, and I absolutely agree with that. We have not had enough of the peer voice here, but as the parent of someone who has schizophrenia, I also find that the peers who choose to participate in these types of things don't speak for my son. And it's a really challenging problem to have those who cannot speak for themselves present in these kinds of conversations.
Yeah, thank you for that, Monica. I think it's actually really powerful to consider. We talk a lot about community, and when we say that, I think we usually mean community as a whole. But I think also the community of those who actually have suffered from mental illness and can be advocates on behalf of each other, right? That includes obviously the broader realm of informal caregivers we've talked about as well. Linda had made this mention of the 22,000 kids moving out of foster care each year. I've heard in conversation earlier and then today as well about beginning when the problem first manifests, right? Like stemming the tide in adolescents and children when it first begins. Fantastic. This is really quite an amazing set of conversations, and Sozosei hears you loud and clear. It's that more of these conversations need to be had and will be had. Our time is coming to a close, and so I'm going to invite Dr. Carson to the virtual stage. He is, as you recall, the chairman of the board for the Sozosei Foundation and previously the long-serving CEO for Otsuka as well. Dr. Carson, I'd love to invite you to reflect a little bit on what you've heard. In no small part, you had a heavy hand in bringing this this matter to the fore. I'll hand it over to you now.
Thank you, Stacy, and your team for facilitating such a thoughtful and productive exercise. Today, we challenge ourselves to not focus on our day-to-day work, but instead to imagine a different future where mental illness is not a crime. We talked about the shared priorities that this community could establish, ranging from creating national systems of care to removing barriers to care to enforcing existing parity laws. And we heard many other fantastic ideas as well. And we discussed some of the barriers that stand in the way, including political will and bureaucracy, discrimination, and a lack of adequate funding and investment. Finally, we learned what each of us could bring to the table. I'd like to thank all of you for bringing your most creative selves to today's discussion. Before we close out our final day of the summit, I'd like to take a moment to reflect on what we've learned and how we can continue to work together. We began our convening with a profound declaration and a new vision for moving forward. Dr. Alpha Stewart, who has spent her life caring for people with mental illness, urged us to recognize and demand that the healthcare system become fundamental to any solution to decriminalize mental illness. The work done by the courts, law enforcement, schools, nonprofits, housing authorities, social workers, and more is absolutely necessary and their progress should be applauded. But healthcare needs to take the mantle. Mental illness is an illness, and it needs to first and foremost be treated as such. We also had the pleasure to hear from 4 of the most influential authors on the subject: Alyssa Roth, Pete Early, Dr. Christine Montrose, and Norm Ornstein. This conversation picked up on the themes Dr. Stewart introduced, but it explored nuances and historical developments that have brought us to where we are today. And we also got a real sense of the human cost of criminalization of mental illness during the dialogue. Their conversation forced us to remember this is not a policy problem, it is a human problem. As we moved into day 2 of the summit, we shifted focus to look at the road ahead. Rebecca Messing-Hagler from Verily helped us to think about how we answer the call made by Dr. Stewart and others on day 1. She shared with us her thoughts on how we can build a healthcare system that embraces the power of data to create meaningful innovation in the healthcare system to better treat, care for, and prevent mental illness. She reminded us that as our world is revolutionized by the power of data and technology, mental health is being left behind. We also had the opportunity to hear from real pioneers in the field. Judge Steve Leifman gave us incredible and pervasive testimony for the enduring, indispensable role of the legal system to remain a critical part of the fight. Debbie Plotnick of Mental Health America gave us unique perspective on the policy debates in mental health that shape our ability to respond appropriately. And Sandy Santana reminded us that too many of our interventions start too late. What I took away from this conversation is that we need to think broad, we need to think early, and we need to keep our ear to the ground. And I thoroughly enjoyed the riveting Pechakucha presentations, which helped us to understand how organizations on the ground are responding today. And that brought us to today, when we got to take an opportunity to ideate and think through creative solutions that, with the demands of our day jobs, we don't often have enough opportunity to do. I hope these rich conversations have us all asking the same question. Now what? As I've shared with you before, it's the vision of the Sozosei Foundation for this summit to not only bring people together and facilitate the exchange of ideas, we want to catalyze action and help propel this work forward. I firmly believe that good work is happening across the country and the globe, but we don't have enough opportunities to validate, share it, and scale it. I hope this summit is a step forward in building more collaboration and finding ways to share ideas across the field. And I know that we at the Sozosei Foundation plan to continue building opportunities for collaboration through future summits and convenings. So keep an eye out for a survey we will be distributing to all of you. It's incredibly important. We want your input on what worked over the past 3 days and what we can do to make the future convenings even more successful. As we've heard over the past few days, there are many groups working to solve this problem and taking different approaches to do so. I hope all of you will continue besides us as we continue on this journey. Thank you to our speakers for sharing your expertise over the past 2 days. And I thank you all for sharing your questions, insights, and ideas. We have a long road ahead of us, but I know that with the creative thinking and collaboration initiated over the past few days, we can go faster together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Carson. And with those thoughts, we thank all of you for coming, for participating in the first 2 days and this session as well. We wish you all well, and as I noted in chat, we will be in touch about future steps and opportunities to connect. Thank you, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care.